vision, commerce. This dichotomy has existed since the beginning of time. At the tail end of the rebel filmmaking era, the maverick director responsible for such films as The Wild Bunch and Straw Dogs was about to take aim at two ambitious young producers looking to elevate their careers. The Osterman Weekend has since become the prophetic final chapter in the career of one of film's most troubled and visionary directors. This is the opening scene of the version director Sam Peckinpah screened for executives and preview audiences in 1983. This incomprehensible, distorted funhouse of images became the breaking point in an already strained relationship between Sam and the film's producers. It would eventually trigger history to repeat itself. Up until the early 1980s, the team of Peter Davis and Bill Panzer had made a handful of moderately budgeted films when they were offered the chance to bring to life the pages of Robert Ludlum's bestseller. An effective screenplay had for years eluded producers Mark Zavitt and Larry Jones, who had originally optioned the book.
We were making a film called Mount St. Helens with Art Carney, and we were in the bar at the end of shooting, and Larry Jones came in, big tall guy, cowboy boots, a master magician. I mean, he's on the board of directors of the Magic Castle, and he came in and started doing card tricks. He knew one of our executive producers. We started talking, and he told us that he had these rights and that so far they had not been able to put it together.
For us, it was clearly an elevation of the level of project that we had been associated with in the past. We had done relatively small budget films prior to that, and this was clearly something that we were very excited about.
The film industry was experiencing a renaissance that started with a string of revolutionary films that captured Hollywood by storm.
Suddenly the place was full of exciting filmmakers making films independently and in fact taking over and running studios. And the whole place was a very vibrant, exciting arena to be an independent producer.
It was much friendlier. There were many more avenues of distribution, both domestically and in the foreign marketplace. Even the studios were more willing to talk to independents.
It was such a maverick community that we ended up with the ultimate maverick as the director of the film. It was perfect.
The Osterman Weekend appealed to both Peter and Bill for different reasons.
So much of Ludlum is internalized, and to be able to take that internal thought process of a main character and be able to bring that to the screen in a way that was dramatically pleasing, I thought it would be very interesting if you could pull it off.
I loved the fact that there were a group of friends who'd gone to college together, had gone off and all become successful, who still stayed in touch once a year at a weekend. And the idea that they could be manipulated into thinking that somebody was coming down on their heads, and the guy could believe that they were guilty of a much larger crime because he in fact was being manipulated, and the friends were no longer close.
You used to think they were great.
Well, times change.
Not for the better.
I read the book, and it had that great sort of, that wonderful quality of being able to turn the page, you know? Keep turning the page, find out what's going on. It wasn't particularly, I don't think it was a great piece of literature, but you wanted to know what happened next, you know? You wanted to know the story.
It wasn't the normal kind of Robert Ludlum sort of progression of thriller, mystery. It had an odd kind of dynamic to it, and I wasn't sure that an audience was going to pick up on it. It was a tremendous storyteller.
People were looking at him as being a CIA because he knew so much, and because his books were so accurate to the degree of, like, they thought he was an agent, that they started investigating him when he was writing these books. but they thought he had inside information. And that came out.
Charged with adapting the book were Ian Masters and longtime Davis Panzer collaborator Alan Sharp.
Ian Masters is a person who is very involved with conspiracies, with what the CIA is doing throughout the world in the United States. And he brought a great deal of expertise about the possibilities of what kinds of surveillance, what kinds of intrusive observation and manipulation the CIA was capable of, which was frankly an area that we didn't know a great deal about. And a lot of the concepts came from him. And he took the script to that stage, at which point we felt that it would be great to bring Alan in and have him bring his, great ability with dialogue and characterization to ratchet it up to the next notch.
With the script in place, the independent producers set out to piece together a complex mosaic of financing that began with a sale of U.S. theatrical distribution, cable, and home video rights.
But the major part of your financing came from foreign pre-sales, and the first step in that direction was to retain a foreign sales company who would go out into the marketplace with your package and sell the project on a territory-by-territory basis.
The difficulties are basically in how complex the thing is and how many people you have to corral to get on board in order to get the financing to make the picture. The plus is that once they have approved the script, the principal cast and the director, they're not involved in the picture the way a studio would be involved. You go ahead, you make your picture as long as you stay on budget. Nobody bothers you. Everybody leaves you alone, and you show them the movie when it's finished. Whereas today, if you got all your money from one source, from a studio, they're in your face, there are notes, there are comments, they watch dailies. I mean, in this kind of a truly independent, pieced-together financing, you're left alone, and that's the trade-off. Once you get started, you sort of forget some of the pain that was involved in getting the deal together, and then theoretically, there should be a lot of pleasure in making the movie.
We were very fortunate that we had a relationship with J&M, probably the premier sales agency in the world at that time. And when we came to them with the package, they were very excited about it. But obviously the next step was director. Who's directing your piece?
In a town where it's who you know, not what you know, an off-the-cuff suggestion by a friend led them to out-of-favor legend Sam Peckinpah. The ensuing partnership mutually benefited both parties. Sam was pretty much at a low ebb in his career. In fact, there had been a 5-year hiatus between Convoy and Osterman. That was a very long break, I'm sure a lot longer than he would have optimally liked. I think his state of mind at the time would have been perhaps rather akin to a movie star, a leading man, who is now being relegated to smaller character parts.
At that point in time, Sam was outside the studio system. No one within the studio system was going to hire Sam Peckinpah. The reality of it is that his last shows within the system, within the studio system, were not, let's just say, pleasurable from anyone's point of view. But he had some good friends in town, Marty Baum in particular, who had been partners with Sam and had done a number of projects with him. And Marty certainly was his champion.
I did 4 pictures with Sam. 2 of them I was head of the studio, 2 of them I was a producer, and then finally I became an agent. And I represented Sam to direct the picture.
Marty was incredibly supportive. He said, I'll talk to Sam. I will keep him on the track because he needs this picture. You need Sam to get the picture made. Sam needs to do this picture properly to get back in the motion picture business, and I'm going to make sure that he does it.
Sam was in ill health, partially because of the many mind-altering substances he was fond of using, but he'd also had a heart attack and he'd had a pacemaker inserted, and he was scratching around doing anything he could. He was doing second unit directing, actually, for Don Siegel, who had been one of his earliest mentors in the business, and I think he would have given anything to have got back and actually directed a major feature film.
Sam's involvement absolutely made this thing a happening event.
Right, because it blew everybody's mind at Sunset Gower Studios, where our offices were, when Sam Peckinpah walked in to have a meeting with Davis and Panzer. Our status with the guards and the phone operators went way up.
Speed. Take one.
All the use of video and the whole watching people, and that manipulation thing. We like to sit back and watch. We almost experience ourselves more by watching ourselves than by living ourselves. It was really one of the first films that did that, I think.
Without a major studio bankrolling them, the intricate nature of the funding forced Peter and Bill to secure a bond from a completion guarantor to pacify any investor fears.
Film is financed through a large group of contracts and letters of credit. These people pay their money when you deliver the film to them. If there's a problem with delivering the film, if the cost gets higher, that's not their issue. They've agreed to pay $1 million for this territory. When you deliver the film, you get the $1 million. The completion guarantor guarantees to the bank that is loaning the money that the film will be completed. And if there's a cost overrun, then the completion guarantor pays that money.
In the building industry, a construction bond, they guarantee delivery of a finished building. And the film industry, the completion bond guarantees delivery of a finished product.
Completion bonds are often issued for independent films, but when the producers shopped around, they were met with a decisive response.
There were 2 or 3 bonding companies that were the major players in the industry that said, no way, Jose, we're not doing a Sam Peckinpah movie. His reputation at that time was enough to make grown men cry.
Peckinpah's agent was prepared to do whatever it took to get his client on the picture.
Lie, steal, cheat, fabricate, anything, get the money. That's an independent film business.
Marty's involvement and assurances as to Sam's reliability were the key to closing the bond and allowing the producers to move forward.
People were very intrigued with the idea of working with Sam, of being part of his comeback picture. And we found that the doors at the major talent agencies were very, very open to us. In particular, Jack Gelati at ICM, who has always been a friend of the independent producers, he was very, very helpful with the project.
All right.
You believe it. John, you look real happy there.
Looks a little like Jesse James, you know? Is that a tie or a pantyhose?
No, that's his Argyle swimsuit look.
We looked around for the best actors that we could find and didn't feel that we needed to always have somebody who was on the nose.
I needed training.
After seeing Soldier of Orange and Blade Runner, suddenly you have an actor who was a really interesting actor whose star was on the rise, who had done a very provocative film with Ridley Scott, and who wanted to work with Sam and wanted a leading role.
I don't think I was an obvious choice. I remember making a film in Jamaica while this started to come up. And Nicholas Roeg, who was the director on that, said, "What? You got an offer to work with Sam? You better make up your mind fast, you know." He said, "Just do it."
But the Dutch actor was faced with a curious dilemma.
They didn't tell me who to read the script for. Sam said, "Which character is the one you fancied?" And I said, "Well, I think it's sort of obvious where I am right now that you would probably give me the bad guy. And I'm not so sure if that's so interesting for me. But Tanner, I think, is very interesting."
Locking him into the piece, again, was another step in elevating the package that we were assembling. And then we were able to attract Burt Lancaster.
He was a giant star worldwide. He, in his own way, brought an imprimatur that this was a first-class production with one of the half a dozen greatest stars who've ever lived.
Comfort yourself with the thought that you never did have a choice. It's usually the case.
Once we had Burt on board, we were able to attract Dennis Hopper, Craig T. Nelson, Helen Shaver, Cassie Yates, Chris Sarandon, John Hurt, and Meg Foster.
That's such a wonderful ensemble cast that were attracted because of Sam, because it was a Ludlum book. But you always get back because of Sam.
The deceptive nature of the plot's villain required an actor who could display an unusual characteristic.
This is a very quirky character facet. I mean, something absolutely terrible has happened to him.
You got your wife back from those bastards. Puts you way ahead of me.
A very elaborate plot for revenge is the work of a mind that has become a little twisted. It's the highest level of field operative who is now working against the very company that trained him and created him. And you need somebody who can do wonderful, strange pieces of business and make you believe it and make you see the twisted world that he lives in.
The Osterman Weekend came to my attention in the same way, basically, that most films do. It lands on your desk, you look at it, and you pass it, and you go and make a cup of tea, and you come back and you look at it again, and eventually you read it. Rather like the book, you could turn the pages. It was interesting. Definitely it was interesting. Obviously it was going to be interesting because Mr. Peckinpah was going to direct it, you know?
Each actor's introduction to the Osterman Weekend was just as unique as the characters they were going to embody.
I had been doing a television series called Cagney and Lacey, and we shot 6 episodes. And I picked it up on the stipulation that they recast. And the producer called me and told me, success, we have success, you know, we got picked up. And I just said, that's terrific. And he said, but there's a hook, you know, you're not going to be a part of it. And I went, well, that's all right, you know, things have to go on. So this was really the first film opportunity that I had after that, and I was very grateful for it.
Bravo, John Tanner.
I was working in Columbia Studios. I was doing documentaries, and I had an office on the first floor. There was always stuff going on there. It was like the Gower Gulch. It was early days. I mean, Fleetwood Mac recording. I mean, there was just, it was pretty active. And one day down the hall, I see this guy walking. And I looked, and I thought, geez, that guy looks familiar to me. And it was Sam Peckinpah, and he was setting up offices. I'd watched him come in 2 or 3 times, and finally I decided to go down and see if I couldn't get a part in the movie. I wasn't even thinking about acting again, but I was such a big fan of his. He comes strolling down there in those cowboy boots, and eventually I got in. And I got like through 2 or 3 different readings, and I got the part, but it was an escapade all the way. It was truly phenomenal.
I went into the audition because it was Sam Peckinpah, and I figured if he wanted to meet me, I had to meet him because he was Sam Peckinpah and he was this legendary filmmaker. I was almost set to go off to Israel to do a film, and I really went in there expecting that I would not like him, that I would not want to do the film. I figured I was about to meet a misogynist who would belch and fart and try to grab my ass, and that had no understanding or appreciation of women, and whatever image I had was so not what I met. And I walked into this room and there was this big, big desk and this tiny man with, you know, silver hair and sparkly green eyes sitting behind this desk, and he completely disarmed me. I mean, 15, 20 minutes later I left there and I had agreed to do the role, and it was a great experience.
Chris Sarandon came to the table with impeccable acting credentials. He had been nominated for an Academy Award for Dog Day Afternoon, wonderful stage credits. He met Sam, they got along very well, and it was an easy decision.
I'll never forget it. I've never had a meeting like this ever in my entire career. I was told that he was interested in my playing this role, but that he'd never met me and wanted to meet me. And I was very excited because I'd heard so much about Sam. And actually, he was in an office sitting at the other end of the room, sitting behind a desk. Held out his hand. I walked over. I shook his hand, and he said, "You're hired." Never in my life has that happened to me.
Right before our interview was over, I said to him, we have someone in common. And he said, oh, who's that? His name is Ron Starr. He was one of your actors in Ride the High Country. And he said, and how do you know Ron Starr? And I said, he and I have a child. And he said, and how is Ron? I said, right now I don't know. He said, all right. He said, Sam, the one, syllable, one, go on. And what's your son's name? Christopher. And then he just said, see you around. Knock 'em dead, whatever you do.
The last two members of the ensemble cast to come on board were Dennis Hopper and Cassie Yates, both Peckinpah alumni.
When I came in for the job on Osterman, it was pretty interesting. I just saw what I was going to be involved with and who I was going to be involved with. I said, this is going to be a ride. It doesn't matter what script I had in front of me. Everybody wanted to make this movie because of Sam Peckinpah. And in my heart of hearts, I had done his last movie, Convoy, and I thought this was going to be his last movie because I knew how destructive he was.
I mean, how could you have a movie directed by the ultimate American maverick without having the guy who had played the ultimate American maverick 10 years before? It was a perfect, perfect match.
Anytime you have Dennis in a movie, you're ahead of the game. He's such an unusual personality. He's bigger than life character, bigger than any role that he'll be in. And when he expressed that interest, Sam was clearly pleased, and he found that the particular role that Dennis played suited his personality, and we locked it up.
I can remember very well the first read-through of sitting at the table, and I mean, I was looking at John Hurt and Rutger Hauer, and they were looking at me, and I had most of the lines, you know. And it was like, oh my God, and these guys are looking at me like, who the hell are you? And I, of course, I'm looking at them like, I don't know who I am, you know. And we went through it, and it was, you know, an amazing experience for me.
The last character needed to be realized was the site where the friendly reunion would take its twists and turns.
We would go out and drive around for days and days. Originally, we kind of thought it would be more in the Malibu hills, and we'd drive around. We were driving through the hills of Malibu looking for a particularly desolate house that was owned by some rock singer who wanted to rent it out. And we're going up and back and forth on these switchbacks, and it's, you know, it's getting a little rock and roll in there. And all of a sudden, Sam yells, "Stop the car." And we throw open the door, and Sam gets out and gets violently carsick outside of the RV. And Walter Kelly, his best buddy, goes, "Look at this, old blood and guts Peckinpah blowing lunch." I mean, Sam laughed harder than anybody else about it. And we found the estate that had been owned by Robert Taylor up in Mandeville Canyon. And it was a perfect, perfect place for us because it not only was a great location that had everything we needed, the pool house, the grounds, all that stuff, but it also had a guest house for Sam to stay.
It's way up the end of Mandeville Canyon, which is one of the older canyons here in Los Angeles area. It's classically, you know, 1940s, 1950s. Open, and you drive in, and there's beautiful white fencing, and there's a fabulous stable. And the house is actually sort of in a big semicircle around the pool, and it moves very, very, very nicely. And it was a perfect setting, I think, for the film, for the Tanner home. Affluent enough, had lots of rooms for all the company.
It's a magnificent place. You could envision this being Tanner's home, it being someone who was a different species, which John Tanner was. I mean, he was this investigative type of reporter. You could see him having this type of home. It suited his personality very well.
The horror is anything can be contrived, anything can be created, anything can be overheard, anything can be misconstrued. So if one doesn't listen to themselves in the night when they're going to bed and really go through all the stimuli that they've been through in one day or heard, and just get quiet with yourself and ask yourself really what is true. The Osterman weekend did deal with that.
As part of our ongoing process to attempt to raise private money, we were introduced in London to a gentleman who was a serious investor. As part of the financing package, he was going to put up as collateral for the loan $5 million of, I think it was J.C. Penney bearer bonds. And so anyone that was going to put up $5 million for this project, I wanted to make sure he kept very close to us. So we spent a great deal of time in Chelsea. And
Peter moved into his apartment.
I moved into his apartment. He was my next best friend. And every day we would call, have the bonds arrived, He was supposed to have them couriered from Switzerland. And finally, shockingly enough, the bonds did arrive, and they were sent to our investment banker, and they were sent to the vault, and we finally got a call saying, Mr. Davis, I have to tell you the bonds did arrive. And I was just so delighted. He said, but Mr. Davis, they're counterfeit. To say that took the steam out of us with these gross understatements.
That's right. So that may be the reason that we suddenly decided there could be no more milk for your cereal. If you wanted cereal, you had to eat it dry. You could use milk for coffee. But it probably was caused by this guy in the counterfeit bonds.
We cannot have any milk. It's either milk or film.
This real-life intrigue would foreshadow just how vital a role funding would play, and why Davis and Panzer took the situation so seriously.
The money, was the money not all in place, Bill? Did we start a movie without the money being all in place?
Did the train start to leave the station ever so slowly?
Did we go against that first cardinal principle that thou dost not start shooting without permanent financing being in place? Nah, not us.
Like any director, Peckinpah had a core group of people whom he preferred to work with, but outside forces created unforeseen events.
I don't think the bonding company had any interest in assembling an old Sam Peckinpah crew.
They didn't want to put the Wild Bunch together again.
Yeah, I'm sure that did play a role in not having him have his entire ensemble crew as part of this package. But any crew after 2 days of shooting is going to be the director's crew in any event. They fall in love with Sam Peckinpah, they're going to go the distance for Sam Peckinpah. Doesn't matter whether they worked with him on 5 pictures before or not. It becomes his crew.
Where are you putting all these cameras?
Everywhere. The whole house will be covered.
The relationships between producers and directors are always stormy.
Oh, tell me how to fight. Won't be hard to make that sound real.
I mean, you are creative antagonists. I mean, you both have a similar goal, but it's never exactly the same. And as Don Guest, who was the associate producer and had worked with Sam before, he said, all I'll tell you guys is Sam will never want to start shooting. And once he starts, he will never want to stop shooting. But that's the way directors are. That's the very nature of the director. They want more preparation. Once you actually make them start shooting, they don't ever want to stop because there's always another shot. There's always another scene. And we have a responsibility, both financially and creatively, to the project that we developed to make sure that some way we work together to get the movie finished, and we're both pleased to have our names on it.
Sam did not like producers. It has to be said that they were his mortal enemy, it seemed, from day one. There were legendary fights on Ride the High Country when he was in fact barred from the editing of his second film. He then had similar run-ins with many other producers that he was involved with. The only constant in his life, producer-wise, was Martin Baum, who was his agent and advisor and sort of consigliere at times.
Conflict came to him naturally, automatically, out of the air. He was a rugged individualist. He wanted to do things the right way, his right way, and he fought to do it that way.
He demanded that producers be assholes in his mind, and he would send them memos, and he would make sure that, you know, he would push the edge of the envelope until they said no, and then he would do it.
It's like a sergeant in the army, you know. It's like a drill. They have to drill down. It's a game. And I guess, you know, I know he could get serious about that game, but I guess, you know, as a good producer, you would probably get it and go, oh, come on, Sam, stop it already.
By this point, particularly in Peckinpah's life and career, it didn't matter who it was. They were going to be the enemy, and they were cast in that role from the first moment of the production.
Every day there was little scenes, drama, that had to do with the production, that had to do with the caliber of the work Sam wanted to do, which had to do with the fact that he wasn't going to be able to do certain things that he wanted to do. Having known about their past and then being there to witness it and witness the frustration on everybody's behalf, on the producer's half, on Sam's half, how it would affect the actors.
John, he said, no matter how nice a producer may be, you gotta learn to hate him.
As long as he was doing what was true to himself, I think he was fine with himself. As soon as he bent over for somebody else, then he would kick himself in the butt because he would not be true to himself. If you didn't like it, he is really fighting for the underdog. That's why he lived in Mexico. He lived in his motorhome at Paradise Cove in Malibu. He was a defiant one. He was trying to prove something, you know.
Sam took you through the gamut of emotions. You had such respect for his talent, yet you knew that the way he viewed the process was so dangerous for you as a producer and could put you in such peril as a producer and put you in a position where you had to be at the other end of the spectrum in dealing with him, just by the nature of his personality and who he was and the nature of the independent production world. So you had this inherent conflict. On the one hand, such respect. On the other hand, you knew what your role in this game was. It created an immense conflicts that certainly did not make Bill or I happy many steps along the way.
I think that he needed an enemy. I think that he was very much of the kind of artist who believed that conflict breeds creativity. It wasn't just producers, to be fair. Producers got in the way for Sam. They somehow always prevented him or were trying to prevent him. They were always actively seeking somehow to derail him.
The Osterman weekend was such a unique experience in a lot of ways. The shooting, in a way, mirrored the movie. We were cooped up in this house, basically the whole shoot. We all had to become friends because we were around each other basically every day, 5 days a week for, long days, sometimes long nights. And the atmosphere was very collegial, but at the same time very intense. And there were a lot of things that came up as a result of that that made it very interesting revelations about the actors who were actually playing the parts, the things we found out about each other, the kind of dynamic that evolved vis-a-vis the shooting itself, our dynamic not only together, but our dynamic with Sam. It was a fascinating and rather unforgettable experience.
It was amazing when we were all together because there was so much happening all the time. It was really like a party because it was a weekend, so there was all that environment of everybody's getting together, plus all the subplots and everybody, having their hidden agendas, and there were all these little zingers going on.
There was a moment when I was not getting on well with Sam at all, and Bert saw that, and he asked me to go out to eat with him. He said, "You look to be a little bit worried by the way things are going." I said, "I am, definitely." Bert said, "Don't be. You're working with a man who is trying to claw his way back to the top. Just understand that." He was very helpful man indeed.
I grew up on his cowboy movies when he was a real star, and you feel like you're a kid. I remember at one point, the crew was moving to a different shot, and he said to Sam, "Let me do one more." And he did something in that one take that had that sort of kingdom of his talent.
Bert was an absolute down-to-earth character to deal with. I remember that we had a 70th birthday party for him on the set, and he was very touched by it, and our dealings with him were wonderful. He was just a wonderful man to deal with.
And, unlike most actors, he is just as tall off-screen as he is on-screen.
During the dinner scene, there was a moment where I had to deck Miss Shaver.
Oh, yeah, where we practiced 93 times with the stunt coordinator doing it, and we were great, man. She put it right past me. I had to throw the thing.
It was all perfect. We really got it down well. And then when they went to film it, I don't know if I took a step too much forward because we really had it pretty choreographed. I was very nervous about doing it. And I connected with Helen's jaw.
She smacked me. She hit me. She clocked me. That's right.
And her head flew back, and I actually put a welt on her jaw. It was just horrifying. She was very gracious about it, and then we did it again.
Good evening. Welcome to Face to Face. The title of our program tonight is Alpha to Omega.
I was very much feeling on edge because it was the first main character that I got to play in an American movie. And so, of course, the language was sort of an issue for me because this was an American anchorman, and he had to not have an accent. I had to work on that very hard, and it's tedious work because it limits you in your freedom. In terms of if you wanted to improvise, you're always a bit unsecure in doing it because, pronunciation and that sort of thing. So I worked with a dialogue coach to at least do the best I could.
I have this scene that I have to do in the hot tub, and I'm going, I know he's going to do something to me. I know it. And we're doing the scene, and I start sliding down like this because Sam has unplugged the water out of the hot tub.
Joe, what is that?
And he goes, you have to sit up for this. I said, you took the water out of the tub, didn't you? He goes, you won't sit up. I said, you want to see my tits again, don't you? I just want them to float. We come back after lunch. Here's Sam with 25 baby blue balloons behind the camera. He goes, if the actress sits up, she gets the balloons. And if you watch that scene, I know I've got a clenched jaw like, I'm gonna kill him. He's done it again. And he's laughing the whole time behind the camera.
Why are you doing this to us?
We were doing a big scene in the kitchen where we were all in the kitchen at night, and it was quite a wide shot and complicated scene, and we'd rehearsed, and everybody knew the edge of frame, and we did it, and Sam said, yeah, print. No, sir, we can't print. The boom was in. What do you mean the boom? Okay, check it. Blah, blah. You know your place? No. Okay, fine. Second time, boom was in, and by the third time, Sam just called cut in the middle of it, threw the guy off the set, took the boom, and he just had a pacemaker put in. I mean, he's, he was older than his years, really. His body was pretty trashed out, and there he stood and held the boom over the scene, and that's what he did.
Bernie? I really like your mustache.
Sam hated that damn mustache.
So it makes me want to curl up in it.
I think we went through 50 of them. I never felt good with it. Never. Ever. Almost every time I come on the set, he said, is that the same mustache you had on? Yes. And it was about making you feel a little bit insecure. And he'd laugh about it, and he'd say, can you take that one off? Is that, or did you grow that one? I said, well, how the hell would I grow it? I had a fake. He said, well, my memory. And he said, God, the mustache looks terrible. Do something with it.
Strident son of a bitch.
My first child was born just after the movie's finished shooting, so that was sort of hanging over me for the entire shoot. The movie is flavored with the sense that I had at the time, which is I was literally straining to get out of there because I knew that my wife was going to give birth at any moment. I was afraid we were going to run over. So, in a way, I have a feeling that kind of informed my performance. There was a kind of tension there that maybe worked for me.
The restrictions on shooting at the Robert Taylor estate were numerable and painstakingly discussed.
We weren't supposed to shoot out the windows. And we weren't allowed to do any damage to the pool. We're really gonna shoot up the outside because I had it squibbed and all.
Oh my God.
We just went in. To my knowledge, I think that's what happened.
I don't think the gentleman that owned it really understood what he was getting himself in for. When we took over that place, I would suspect it was never the same. When you have a crew descending on a location like that for a very extended night shooting that went on for weeks at a time, and you have 100 people tromping through your property, you shouldn't have done that deal.
Peter and Bill were standing around on the set, and Sam was saying how he wanted to, have this window explode. And they were telling him that you can't break the window. And Sam said, no, the window has to be broken, blah, blah, blah. No, but you cannot break, no, you can't break the window. No, the window can't be broken. And eventually Sam just walked over and put his foot through the window and the window broke. And he said, yes, the window can be broken. That was it, he just did that stuff.
The fact that this was such a serious night shoot, you can't understate how draining that is on a crew and also on Sam. Those become very long, cold nights, day after day, week after week. Tough stuff.
Yeah, and it was around December, as I recall, November,
Yes.
December,
Yeah.
it's like that. It was, you get in those hills, it's truly cold. Everybody's got the big parkas on and the boots and all that, and it's wet, and it's a physical effort to direct the movie under those conditions.
Sam wasn't moving too well. His immune system was shot. He'd been told to stop drinking on more than one occasion, and so I think at that time he'd switched to sake, considering it a non-alcoholic drink. He'd suffered a cut on his finger before we started the movie, and so he was directing from this kind of a intravenous tripod. His hand was hung in this sling, and he had a bandage on it, and the wound wouldn't heal, so he had to wheel this thing around with him everywhere he went. So it was funny and sad at the same time.
At the time we were shooting the picture, he had a pacemaker. He had literally a minder, somebody who was around all the time to make sure that he didn't drink too much. That is not to say that they were worried about the fact that he wouldn't be able to function, but this was just in terms of his health. His health was very precarious.
He was already on a whole lot of medicine, just trying to make it, without too much pain in the day. So he had moments basically where he got intense and feisty and funny, and then he took breaks. I mean, all during the shoot, he'd do that. He'd let everybody do his work. He would just go and take a little nap or something, and then come back, and then the sparks started flying.
It's 2, 3 in the morning. Mandeville Canyon, it's in January, it's colder than heck, and he's got to have the water at certain temperatures so the cameras are able to see, because if it gets too warm, it gets cloudy. Well, by this time, you've shot 80 billion squibs into the doggone pool, and they're floating. They got to be scraped out, so you're there, you're waiting. I get shot in the leg and flip and turn and plop, swim to the bottom, grab this rope that they put down there by the drain, and stay down there. And they come up to the top and break the surface, and you're out of breath, and that's the shot. Plus the coat's now waterlogged. I crawl over the side of the pool. I'm just laying there, and I'm done. And Sam comes over and he says, "Hey, Fish." That was his nickname for me. "Hey, Fish, what's wrong?" And I says, "I'm not going to do this anymore." He says, "Yes, you are." And I said, "No, I'm not, Sam. I can't do it." He says, "You will." And I says, "Why? Why? Why would I do this?" He says, "Because I'm asking you to." Okay, all right, I'll do it one more time, I guess. We all knew, I think, that he was, he was dying, and you hoped it wasn't true, but, he had that that twinkle, man.
All right, Fazit. That's me. I'm finished. I've had it. I want out.
And where might out be?
I'm fed up. Do what you have to do. Arrest them. I don't care. Just get them out of my house.
It was actually incredible to watch John and Rutger together because they're such different actors, and John is so physically fluid and easy with everything, and Rutger, who's a fascinating actor, really, but physically so different. I mean, I remember watching the two of them and going, God, John's whole body is connected and it just moves as seamlessly, it's all there. And Rutger, I would watch him go through the rehearsals. By the time that they rolled, it would all be connected, but it was as if his body and his head were two different things.
Rutger's an amazing guy. He existed in another universe. Hey, Rutger was punk before there was, we spent so much time in the water in that pool, getting shot at, and the guy never complained. He was always helpful. Same with John Hurt and Dennis. Everybody was, everybody's doing their thing.
It's my job to convince you of the truth of these allegations. We could arrest all of the conspirators now, but it would be more helpful to the interests of the nation if we could have your assistance over the coming weekend.
John, first of all, his voice is, he's got such a voice, you know, that voice can say anything and you believe it. I remember I felt slightly on edge with him too because the scene was very well written for his character. It wasn't quite as strong for my character.
These people represent a grave threat to the security of the United States of America.
Uh-huh. And you feel how easy it is and how much freedom there is in the bad guy. Because, you know, they have the cards. I felt Tanner's part was not sharp enough or something. But maybe it was just me who wasn't sharp enough.
He was working with my son Christopher, who played the part of Steve, and he puts a gun to Chris's head, and I come out and he says, "I've got your son," and so, of course, it's all over. Being a mother and being an actor, I didn't realize that it would be so difficult with having, you know, my child on the set, but there was. You felt incredibly responsible for his doing things properly or coming up with the goods or whatever. He just said, "I'll take care of it, don't worry. You know, don't worry, I'll get him to react." But it was so wonderful because he grabbed Christopher and he took this gun.
Remember me?
He jammed it into the back of his head and I watched.
I don't think we'll need the bow. Huh? Going to take a little trip, the three of us.
It was very easy to relate to. My son's eyes went, you know, like this. And I knew that it like really frightened him and not a whole lot frightened Christopher. So it was a good moment.
At the time I was just over 2 years sober. I hadn't had a drug or a drink for just over 2 years at that point. It was really interesting to go into this cocaine, alcoholic, crazed, needy woman. It was a pretty crazy set. I do believe I was the only person there that was sober, and I was the only person who was playing a drug addict. So every day I would go to the prop master, and I would say, "Remember, it's water, not vodka. It's cut, not Coke. Please don't help me. I'll do the acting."
Everybody's at the pool. Everybody's supposed to be doing coke, you know, and there's this big pile of it there, and Helen's there, and she's snorting the stuff, and I'm looking at her, and I'm thinking, geez, you know, she's really getting loaded here. This is terrible. And of course, I'm over in my trailer just going nuts, and over at Sam's bungalow just completely bombed out at 4 in the morning. But, you know, there's how, so I go to Sam, I said, "Sam," I says, "you know, we should be able to do this scene without the real coke. You know? I mean, come on, man." He says, what are you talking about?" I was this Helen's over there. She says, "Fish, she's the only one sober here."
Certainly the 70s and the 80s within Hollywood, there was a lot of drugs and alcohol. It was across the boards, you know, I mean, it wasn't divided into one particular, you know, category on the cast and crew list. In that way, it was hidden or not, or people would know, or some people would know, and it could be happening all over a set, but it wasn't ever really talked about.
Sam was a complicated man. The wounds of his life had never fully healed and were the continued source of all his many demons. The combination of a lot of drugs and his alcohol abuse, I think, had left a huge scar, and he was certainly acting in a very paranoid way. So it's, of course, not only ironic, but even obvious that perhaps this film, at this point in his life, would be about surveillance, because he had taken to bugging his colleagues and friends.
My girlfriend, who was his assistant on Convoy and with him on The Getaway and Straw Dogs, he put microphones in her underwear drawer. That was Sam. He goes, "If you don't like it, leave."
He always pushed his friends and colleagues to the limit, and he did it deliberately so that if they did leave, he could say, "Well, I knew it. You see, you didn't really care enough to stay." And if they didn't leave, he would just keep upping the ante and keep increasing the abuse until they did.
He lived through a period where that was not even considered. Nobody talked about that as an abuse. That was a use that took you somewhere. And you have to remember that it did take Sam a long way. And it was, I think, very difficult for him to go into the slower lane.
Sam had tried to deal with it, was not successful. So many people aren't. You either can stop or you can't. You know, this is something that began with him so long ago. It all goes into who he is as a creator and his way of coping and his way also, I believe, of delivering and of being able to birth and work as obsessively and come up with films like, you know, The Wild Bunch and Straw Dogs.
I completely get it. I totally get it. You know, drugs make you feel different, and they work for as long as they work. You know, for me, they stopped working when I was 29 years old. For Sam, I guess they kept working.
It's, you know, it's an edge that he had that I did feel that many people were not quite comfortable with. As if, you know, as if he wasn't serious or as if he was screwing with your head, which he did, you know. But that's what I liked about him so much.
I think Chris Christopherson said at the memorial, the wrong man's been buried. And, you know, that's true of alcoholics, you know. There's a lot of despair and horror associated with that disease, but at the same time, there was an extraordinarily gifted, talented, wonderful, gracious, kind man in Sam Peckinpah, and he was the armadillo.
Sam had a great penchant for notes. He gave great notes. As proof, Panzer and Davis have a file of memorandums from Sam Peckinpah about as long as you're on every matter possible.
Sam believed in documenting the odyssey that he was on, whatever odyssey that was. In his dealings with the studios, he had learned that whatever I say will be twisted. I want to make sure that I have a proper documentation of what actually happened at a meeting. He was a great believer in writing memos, and any time that you would send anything to him, you could be assured that you were going to get a memo back, and he would always record fairly detailed memos of his recollection of what went down at a particular meeting. It may not have been our recollection, but it was his recollection.
They are very funny. I mean, they're very sharp and they're smart, and they show great insight into the filmmaking process and into whatever particular situation was twisting his melon, as Steve McQueen would have said.
The first memo was numbered 0001, so that's when we knew we were in trouble.
Every memo that had to do with post that you would send to him saying that the bonding company has requested that certain work be accomplished by a certain date, he would write back, "We will do the best we can."
Whereas television used to be wonderfully open and, in a sense, naive and happy, it's become more and more cynical. And I think that's a lot of what the film is about.
As production progressed, it became obvious to the producers that the money in place was going to be grossly insufficient. At this time, the Bond company takes an unpleasant approach.
On the one hand, they can be very helpful in assuring there's a discipline with the creative people, with the director, that you can use in a way that's helpful to you. However, once you get into that danger zone where you are in fact invading the contingency, then they move into an adversarial position.
Sam Peckinpah may not have been the easiest man to get along with, but did have a way of getting the best out of those who worked for him.
It's like directing with yes. I mean, I never got a no from Sam. It was all, oh yeah, you know, yeah. What about, you know, what about, oh, that's neat. Oh, show me that. And wonderful rehearsal process before the film started, and then, you know, certainly for each scene.
With a film, which is a selective medium, you have to have a director and an editor and a whole technical side that is also going to understand what our lot are doing. And that, I think, is something which Sam was spectacularly good at. His ability to use image, his ability to use slow motion, his ability to use everything that the camera could offer you, I think was universally recognized. So that's what made him a great director.
Sam is definitely an actor's director. Sam would work differently with everybody. I think that a lot of times he'd sort of steer people and he'd sort of pit people and he'd sort of begin treating, you at a distance rather than embracing anything you were doing. I mean, there was quite a bit of manipulation in how he dealt with a lot of the actors.
He was complex. And if you asked him, what do you want from me in this scene? You don't do that. You say, this is what I'm going to do in this scene. His whole thing was, I hired you to bring what you bring to the role as yourself. If you have to ask me, then I disqualify you. You don't ask Sam, what do you want me to do in this scene? If you do, he will cut your head off. And he did that.
I asked him to try and teach me everything he knew about what I should be doing as an actor. But he really taught me how to listen. He just had this extraordinary intensity behind the camera. I mean, there was no video. He was always looking. And he had these boring eyes. I mean, if everything else was dying in Sam, his eyes were just alive. They were penetrating. And you knew when he was pissed, which was most of the time. And you weren't sure if it was an act. You just couldn't tell. But if he got mad, it scared the hell out of you.
I'd done the scene a couple of times, and Sam had said print, and he'd said print again, and I said, Sam, let me do it one more time.
Face, bitch.
And he said, why? And I said, I just want to do it again. Maybe I can do it better. Maybe he just laughed, and he said, Helen, you and I, we're just the same. I mean, we live our lives all the time, but we're alive in a special way between clap and cut. We're alive like no other time. And he's right. I mean, that's when it's really incredible, is when everybody actually concentrates and comes into the moment to be there for 30 seconds or 2.5 minutes or whatever in order to realize this moment and crystallize it and immortalize it. Here we are 20 years later talking about moments that were frozen on celluloid.
His shows have, by their nature, the type of action that he shoots, which is very complex. To set those scenes and to shoot those scenes takes an inordinate amount of time. It's just not doing a shooting or a killing. When you do a killing in a Sam Peckinpah movie, it's an event. And when you board something and say, this should take 6 or 7 or 8 days, you would think that would be reasonable. Then you get on the floor with Sam and you realize you're just starting to see what it's like to shoot a Peckinpah movie. That, for Bill and myself, was a revelation.
Where's my dog? Not in there.
These intricate scenes took a massive amount of shots. Responsible for piecing together the footage was film editor and future ally Ed Abrams.
When I first came on, I think it was like maybe the first or second day, we went out to the location in the evening, had dinner at this estate that they were shooting at, and met with Sam, and it was a good, it was a good meeting. And he just says, go back and make my film work.
In addition to supervising the editing, Sam also insisted on being involved with sound design, music, and effects. Since the Bond company was now exposed to budget overruns, it was apprehensive of keeping Sam on the picture. This put the producers in a precarious position.
The other side of the coin is that Bill and I wanted this as much as possible to be his process. It was Sam Peckinpah. It should be his process. But that was exceedingly difficult to maintain.
In those days, we were on film, as opposed to today. It's all electronic. And I had a machine called a Kim. It was set up against a wall, and at the other end of the room was the door. So Sam asked to get a big mirror to mount on the wall so that he could see the door. If he happened to be working with me and the producers happened to arrive, he was very cordial, except that he always had a 45 and a whip and some knives on the table. And he'd just say, good morning or good afternoon, gentlemen, is there anything I can help you with? And with his hand on the revolver. And they'd say, no, Sam, we're just checking in to see how you're doing. And they would leave.
What?
The pool house. They're making for the pool house.
I saw the way he worked with the slow motion. It's almost like Michelangelo working with a statue. It didn't happen by magic. It did happen by hard work and the focus and the attention that he put into frame by frame by frame to build that kind of slow motion.
Sam approached everything with a preconceived idea. He used to carry a notebook around. He was shooting. He would structure a sequence from notes that he had already taken. The sequence at the end of the film in the pool, I would really say exemplifies Sam's overall viewpoint of trying to make a film, not so much the action point of view, but kinetically a ballet.
The Ballet of Violence is literally that. It's a unique choreography, and it is quite dazzling to see that in full flight. He would work with his editors to not only choreograph the actual violent incidents, but also to give you a sense of depth and space and time. I think it's largely to do with an innate understanding of how one places oneself in the center of a battle.
He had such a distinct and impeccable capability of cutting in the camera. The editing was an art form in itself. You weren't editing to make scenes work necessarily or to cut. You were editing to layer. I mean, his action sequences are always layered.
Sam felt that there was always something going on between each frame in that little black area. That was your cue as to where to make that change from 16 frames per second to 48.
It sort of defied genre in a way. It was kind of a spy movie. It was a thriller. It was a mystery, but it was, in a way, none of the above. It was really more a story of the interpersonal relationships between these people.
Sam Peckinpah was used to work with a colleague of mine, Jerry Fielding, and when Jerry Fielding passed away, Don Siegel, with whom I worked on the Dirty Harry and many, many, many films, recommended me. The spotting of Osterman Weekend was very difficult. I went and I met Sam, who was unfortunately ill, and he was in a bed. It felt like being in a hospital, and that was the cutting room. But no matter how sick he was, he could talk and he was very alert, and I felt sorry, but spotting, which is once we got into the movie, there was no more thinking about he was sick or not. I mean, we were talking like director and composer.
Get your bow.
I decided not to use a big orchestra because that would have been too pretentious. I did it mostly with electronic instruments and some acoustic instruments like flute or saxophone. It was an electroacoustic score. The percussion I used was very shallow, eerie, you know. You take the bow of a bass or a cello and play on cymbals or any kind of on gongs and let it ring, and it creates an atmosphere.
I think you will find that when the time comes, you will be able to leave the country very quickly.
Jesus loves me. This I know.
I had to create the accompaniment, but not to the song. I had to play the movie. I had to build tension and tension and tension until the explosion. So, in a way, the music plays against the song.
Betty, get out! They can't hear us.
Dick?
Things could be worse, right? Right.
That was probably the most challenging part. I was not working with my material. It was not my melody and my harmony and my rhythms, but it was somebody else's melody.
Tells me so.
And I had to, at the same time, play the scene without disregarding what she's singing and without trying to cover her up. It was difficult, but it's not impossible.
We are weak, but he's strong.
Because the film is so full of surveillance and video cameras, a lot of that stuff is done in post-production and is not completed. So there are blank TV screens and there are shots that don't exist. And Sam took the position that until all of those shots were completed, that he had not been delivered the assembly by the editor, and therefore the time clock for his cut had not yet started.
Talk to me, Bernie.
This issue soon became a major bone of contention for the Bond company, considering any delay would have a domino effect on the final delivery deadlines.
If you deliver the picture on time to the distributor, he has to take the picture, he has to pay you the money. If you're late,
He doesn't like it?
He doesn't like it, he doesn't have to pay for it. So it became a back-breaking process.
During this highly tense period, Sam would rely on a distinct form of stress management.
We would always be having meetings in Panzer Davis's office. He had a legal sheet of paper, and the producers would, be giving their points of view of how they saw it, and we would look over and see what Sam was writing, and he just kept writing line after line is, don't get pissed off, don't get pissed off.
At that time, it was the height of tension. Every move that we made was a move that was scrutinized by the bonding company. Every dollar that was spent was scrutinized by the bonding company. Every day that we did not reach certain benchmarks in either sound effects or cutting or delivery of reels to music or to sound effects people, every day that would become a major bone of contention. It was not a pleasurable time.
Sam's belligerence ultimately came to a boiling point when the movie he finally delivered shocked everyone by starting as a distorted and distasteful funhouse of mirrors.
The opening sequence with John Hurt in a hotel room. Sam had shot that in a particular way that only he could perceive what it was really about. We took the film to post-production houses and had it electronically enhanced to the way he saw it. The distorted images were kind of what was happening in John Hurt's head. It's what he saw. It went through many changes, and we cut it in many, many different ways. And when it was previewed, the director's cut, the audience proved Sam wrong because a lot of people walked out.
The icing on the cake turned out to be a sexually gratuitous scene that offended females en masse.
They walked right out at the beginning of that film and didn't give the film a chance to unfold itself, and to this day no one's ever seen that.
We knew at that time that if Sam held to his point of view, that this is his cut, he was standing by it, that we would have to do some serious work on delivering a cut that was our cut, which, to be candid, did not make us particularly happy. But it was inevitable from the reaction of the audience that we would have to move away from his initial cut.
If it's just not playing, then what you like to do is The director says, okay, it's not playing, I can see where I got blah, 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 and he goes off and he does the work and you screen it again, and hopefully then it plays, and you don't have to get into this situation where changes are made by other people.
But that was unfortunately not the case here.
True to form, Peckinpah eventually forced the producer's hand by refusing to make any changes. Davis and Panzer were left with no other choice but to recut the film.
But ostensibly, Sam was not on the film anymore. The day that the producers fired Sam, I didn't particularly enjoy that day of going to work.
It was his way to always say, my movie has been ruined by the producers. I mean, was there a film that he didn't say this on? I don't think so. And to him, the removal of anything that he had put in was cause for massive complaint.
You hate to be a turncoat, but you also have to look at it from a business standpoint. Why work on a film that is going to go up on a shelf the rest of its life? So we hung in and we said, okay, we'll do what the producers want us to do. That was not to negate or take anything away from Sam. He still was a wonderful filmmaker. And I think his body of work stands up to that.
On November 4th, 1983, after a drought of more than 5 years, fans around the world finally got what they were waiting for. Another Sam Peckinpah film. The Osterman Weekend was praised by many for its portrayal of media's harmful influence on society, and is more relevant today than ever before. Yet few have heeded its warning.
As you all know, television programs are just the fillers between attempts to steal your money. So if you want to save some, switch off. It's done with the hand and what is left of your free will.
I think it's probably more relevant today than it was back when it was made. We live in a culture in which there is an epidemic of proliferation of everyone's most private moments. In a way, it's prescient, because at the time, this seemed sort of cutting edge. The fact that somebody was watching somebody else in their most private moments, surveillance cameras in houses, and this is commonplace now. The nanny cam, surveillance of email, it's an epidemic in the culture now.
What we were saying in this film was that television is a dominant force in your life that is so intrusive, so pervasive, so invasive, that it can control you on a level that you don't even know is happening.
You're being manipulated. And this manipulation that we saw in the Osterman Weekend, when you look at it today, that was just a small piece of what today has become so magnified in such a frightening way. The ability of third parties to manipulate your life without you even knowing it. Very frightening stuff.
You're going to get a phone call.
Sam Peckinpah never minced words. So, what would he say about this look back at the making of his last film?
You sons of bitches, I'll kill you.
He'd probably look at each one of us, and if he had a chance to say individually, he'd probably look at us and go, what a load of horseshit.
If Sam knew we were celebrating the Osterman Weekend, he would be a side of his ego that would say, quite right. And there'd also be a side of him saying, well, goddamn. I never got it right anyway.
He tell you to fuck off. He said, I don't give a shit.
He probably asked for a glass of mule piss. I don't know. That's what he called his warm sake.
Oh, crap.
He'd laugh. He'd probably tell you you're full of shit. You don't know what you're doing. Oh, well, yeah, what are you doing? You know. And then if you got him past that, he'd twinkle and he'd find a way to let you know that he was glad.
He'd feel honored, and he'd feel great about it. He'd want to know, what are we doing next? I mean, what's our next deal?
With the passage of time, all are able to reflect on the journey they went through and come away with a better perspective on the lessons learned.
I'm struck by the fact that here was a great talent whose demons, both personal and professional, prevented him from having a longer career and from having left us with more great films.
At the end of the day, Sam made his film. It may not have been everything that he had wanted it to be, but he was back shooting.
The Osterman weekend was something that we can congratulate and thank Bill and Peter for, is giving him the chance to make it. And the fact that he actually did get a film made. And it also happened to be about paranoia and surveillance and the effect of television on the masses, perhaps is an appropriate, logical place for his career to end.
I just felt like I was really, really privileged to be there and to be able to please him and to be able to find that place with him where we got what we wanted, you know. It was like having a love affair, you know, that was for a time, that you knew that had a beginning, middle, and end.
He put his mark on this town because his attitude is on the screen. That's the difference. There's an attitude. It could be just a movie, but it's got Sam's print on it.
It was, you know, it was a real adventure for me, a real adventure to do this film with Sam, you know, all around. I had a blast. I really had a blast.
Out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. To a degree that makes me think about Sam and about the film and about the message of the film. Try to keep the right doing in the right spot. Hell, it was fun. There's no rodeo without Sam.